Grant Swartzwelder, and welcome to the Oilfield Strong webinar. We've got a very special guest today that I am excited to hear his talk, and with some of the advertisements and media coverage, I think there's some very pertinent topics to discuss. As you know, we will be posting this on our YouTube channel. Just go on to YouTube and look under OTA compression, and you'll see this video posted shortly. And then if you have any questions or follow-up, you know how to reach me, and look forward to that. But today I'm very excited to have the Secretary of the Department of Environment, or Environment Department, that as such, he's on the cabinet for the governor in New Mexico. Over 21 years of experience with the EPA in a whole host of areas, but most recently, since January of 2019, being Secretary of the Environment Department, 550 people under management, budget of $100 million. So if we thought we had issues, we need to think again. So, but Secretary Kenney, thank you very much for attending, and appreciate your input on this. You know, if you wouldn't mind, this is kind of maybe more for me, but help me understand the environmental department that you're secretary of versus the energy, mines, natural resource department, which I think is also a cabinet level, but that there seems to be an overlap there, or in my little head there is. How do I break that apart?
Yeah, great to be here, Grant, and thank you for inviting me on to the program. And yes, you nailed it. We have actually 3 state agencies, 2 of which report to the governor. One of is independently elected in New Mexico that oil and gas companies are probably familiar with, but let's go over that. So let's start in the way people think about oil and gas. So depending upon if you're drilling and producing on state land, you'll be going to the state land office to talk to them, and that's headed by a elected official, currently held by Stephanie Garcia Richards. She's our state land commissioner. In terms of getting your approval to drill, you'll also be checking in with the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. That is headed by my colleague and friend, Cabinet Secretary Sarah Cottrell-Probst. And she, like me, reports to the governor, to Governor Lujan Grisham. And my department, so while they're the upfront folks who actually put the minerals or the oil and gas out to bid and then work on getting permits issued, we are at the Environment Department, our focus is on air pollution, ensuring that those oil and gas operations, do exactly what they want to do, which is keep it in the pipe. They want to keep their product, be it oil or gas, in the pipeline. We want to see them succeed that way. And we focus in on ensuring that there is no adverse impact to air quality or the communities around those operations. So from start to finish, those 3 agencies, our 3 agencies, are the ones that most oil and gas companies are dealing with.
So would that be equivalent to the Texas TCEQ because of their focus on the air, or am I being too general with that?
No, you're absolutely right. So TCEQ is the agency that is my analog to the Environment Department. Okay. You could think of the Railroad Commission in Texas being the analog to Energy and Minerals and Natural Resources. Gotcha. And the Texas Land Office, State Land Office, is very similar to the New Mexico State Land Office.
Very good. Thank you. Sorry to have to put it in terms of what a Texan can understand, but that's...
Oh, hey, we're New Mexico. I don't profess to understand what's going on in Texas all the time either. So fair point. There's a little competition between our states is always a healthy thing.
There you go. Well, help me understand. New Mexico has a reputation of being hard on the industry and maybe not appreciative of the oil industry. And but at the same time, the industry needs to behave itself and do certain things from an environmental side, and spills and emissions and all that. How do you merge those 2 together to, you've got rules you want them to follow, but you don't really want to to some degree, they're a golden goose. You don't want to get rid of that either. So how do you handle that, thinking through that philosophical question?
Yeah, it's a great question. 40% of our state budget comes from the oil and gas industry. And agriculture, tourism, outdoor recreation, and other things are very important revenue sources for the state of New Mexico. So we're appreciative of what oil and gas is doing for our state budget, for sure. And you mentioned my budget is in excess of $100 million, and a large portion of that, or a significant portion, an important portion, comes from revenues that the oil and gas industry pays, as does do other industries. So with you on that. Regarding the philosophical, I think we have high expectations for anyone who's going to do business in New Mexico, be it that oil and gas, be the federal installations we have. We have a lot of federal installations in New Mexico. The film industry, the cannabis industry. We have high expectations for anybody who's going to be doing business in New Mexico. So I don't think that's different in the way we view oil and gas or anyone else. And then, on top of that, look at what's happening nationally right now. The Biden administration has placed a great value on reducing carbon emissions through the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. And we'd like to look at maybe this is semantics, but I truly believe this, that the value in the reductions we're getting from oil and gas, or any number of sectors, is equity that they are able to take back to their shareholders, that's validated by what's happening federally. So like production tax credits and things like that in the IRA, our rules are effectively the anti-backsliding provisions that allow those oil and gas companies to gain that additional equity and revenue streams. So I understand your question, and it's one we get a lot, and it's a very good question. However, I would argue that when you invest in New Mexico, you have a solid ground for that investment, in which it's moving forward not at the expense of the industry, but to ensure that we're racing to the top for those operators who want to see themselves as energy companies.
And I think that's very fair. To obviously you're charged with protecting your state and your environment. When we start looking at areas like Eddy and Lee County, for example, have robust, great rock, great production, but then you go up to Northwest Shelf, it's a little more marginal. And how do you look at applying rules between the two different areas? Because if you have certain requirements for that marginal production, it could make it uneconomical, and then you've got your own issue of unrecovered reserves. So how do you look at kind of the high producers of those two main counties versus other areas?
Yeah, I think one aspect of the answer to your question is, very versed in understanding not all oil and gas is the same. From your vertically integrated companies who can afford, to absorb the cost of regulation, to the smaller stripper and marginal wells, the mom and pops of the industry, who, quite frankly, from an environmental perspective, if all of them walked away, we would have produced water issues, significant produced water issues, potentially contaminating our potable water supply. And we, like West Texas, have water issues. So first, I think the answer to your question is to recognize that we're not dealing with an industry that's a monolith. It's very, very segmented between the large producers, the big producers, who could be independents as well, right? Sure. And vertically integrated, as well as some of the smaller producers. So I think recognizing that is something that we've done in the way we regulate oil and gas. Then secondly, not everyone's in the Delaware Basin. Not everybody has access to the same lucrative leases that others have. And realizing that as you move into different parts of our oil and gas plays, and again, I not only think of the Permian, but I also think of San Juan in the northwest part of the state.
Yes.
We have to craft policies that are respective for the diversity of operators as well as the diversity of geographic locations. If you don't recognize that, then you are missing the entirety of the industry. So I think happy to get into further examples too of how we've done that. But I think that's a first recognition that we have in our state.
Yeah, it's just we actually are working with a client that has some production up in the non-Delaware, and it's just 10 barrel a day type wells, but they're going to be asked to do some things from an environmental side that are going to be very economically challenging. So it's going to be interesting to see how y'all balance that, because you want to make sure the environment's taken care of, but shutting in production probably is not the ultimate goal either. So
yeah, and I don't start with the premise that oil and gas companies don't want to keep their product in the pipeline. I mean, that's somewhat, a bad proposition to start with. Their goal is to keep their product in the pipeline. I should have mentioned earlier too that I'm an engineer by education, and I understand that PV equals nRT. And the minute you bring you bring something that's compressed out of the ground and open it up to atmospheric conditions, there are inherent losses. Like, right, that's physics. That's not indicative of someone's social investment. However, I will say that engineering and that PV equal Newtonian physics has been around a lot longer than you and I, and therefore, planning for those phase changes is exactly the point that we're trying to get to. And when you mentioned the 10 barrel per day producer, I'm thinking about how does our rule affect a 10 barrel per day producer. And we've basically said that if you're a small operator and don't have the potential to emit large quantities of pollution, the associated BTEX, if you will, that comes off these operations, then you have less to do than somebody who's than producing many barrels per day, much greater magnitude. So we've tried to scale our rule for air quality to focus respectively on that concept of potential to emit. If you can't emit it, you inherently have less to do, not nothing to do, right? You have less to do. And if you have the potential to emit a lot more, then you get into things like air pollution control devices and optical gas imaging. But again, it's a full recognition of the industry not being a monolith.
Okay. Well, one of the main reasons I wanted to visit with you, because you are now chairing a very ominous sounding committee, the Environmental Crimes Task Force. So I guess putting the word crimes in there, if you wanted attention, there you go, you got it. So help me understand what it is, what the goals are. Should the industry be scared? All those good things.
Yeah, it's not intended. It's intended to. Maybe the way government names things could be better. But that we're so pragmatic in the way we do things. Sometimes maybe we should think a little bit more about those. But should the industry be scared? I think I would turn that question around and say, if someone's not intentionally avoiding the law or intentionally underfunding for the purpose of economic gain, then no, they shouldn't be scared whatsoever.
That's fair.
Think of it as this. For your 10 barrel producer, or if you're a large integrated producer, you're making a certain commitment when you say you're going to extract oil and gas from the state of New Mexico. You're making a certain commitment that you're going to bring those resources to market in a way that makes New Mexicans whole and protective of the environment. If you are, and I'm going to use this word intentionally, if you're being deceptive about that, if your intent is to create an unlevel playing field, for you and your competitors, or you against your competitors, you should be worried, because those are the type of operators we're looking at. Those are the type of industries, forget operators, like to say this is oil and gas. Those are types of businesses we're looking to investigate under the Environmental Crimes Task Force. And it's not just oil and gas, there's other industries. I'll stick to this industry given the nature of, our focus, your focus. But if you're managing your produced water in the way state law requires it, and you're not intentionally dumping it into the Pecos River to avoid disposal costs, you're fine. Those are the things we're looking for. So the Environmental Crimes Task Force is really focused in on intent and criminal behavior, not the I forgot to write down my pressure drop, I forgot to write this down. Those are civil issues that we deal with all day, every day, and exercise enforcement discretion when we need to, or issue a citation when we need to. Environmental crimes are very different because of the intent and nature, and typically those may end in a penalty or even an indictment and prison time if found to be a criminal intentional problem.
Have you seen an increase in those type of activities or crimes, and thus the need for this task force, or is it just trying to be more proactive?
So it's interesting. Mostly every state has an environmental crimes task force that works with prosecutors at the criminal prosecutors at the state and federal level. New Mexico hasn't had one for a number of years. So our instituting an environmental crimes task force is not necessarily indicative that we're seeing more environmental crimes. I would say just the opposite. We haven't been looking for them because we haven't had an environmental crimes task force. And as somebody who's very versed and supportive of enforcement, if you're not looking for it, you won't find it. And I always think about enforcement as leveling the playing field. If somebody can do something better, or let's say an operator is going to cut corners, that is an unfair competitive advantage that they have given themselves over everybody else who's trying to do the right thing. And you don't have to be a government official to say one bad apple spoils the bunch, right? Like, we know that. And we want to value those who are doing the right thing, and seek out those who are doing the wrong thing.
Fair enough. Any update? It sounded like it got kicked off. It's so just kind of getting organized right now, or is it in full activity?
Yeah. So we're still organizing, and what's happening, and I'll break the news here first.
Oh.
Our federal and state agencies, along with federal and state prosecutors, are getting together this spring to do a workshop to go through what are the elements of an environmental crime, what does it look like from an evidence standpoint, what does it look like from a legal prosecutorial standpoint, and we're training up all the different agencies so we have a common vocabulary, a common vision, and since we've announced that we've had a few referrals come to us, I frankly couldn't even tell you if they're oil and gas off the top of my head. I don't think they are, but we've had a few referrals come to us, and we're really needing to organize ourselves this spring in like the April timeframe to kick off our cohesiveness so we can then work and lead our staff to work on these issues together.
And I think that's an important point that I failed to make, that you clearly in environmental department do more than just oil and gas. So the task force isn't specifically at oil and gas. It's covering everything in the environment.
Absolutely. So, whether it's a chop shop that's stealing catalytic converters, that has an air quality issue, right? That causes air quality issues. whether it is somebody who is dumping hazardous waste out on a reservation or sovereign area, that trips both state and federal law, tribal laws, or whether it's, an operator of a drinking water treatment plant who's saying that I've tested this water and it's safe, when in reality they didn't test it and it's not safe. Our environmental crimes task force is looking at a multitude of environmental crimes. This is not an oil and gas environmental crimes task force. It will be brought into it just like everything else.
Fair enough. That's great. Well, let's move to another topic that had a lot of people's attention. That's the non-attainment designation.
Yes.
For the Permian. And in reading on this, I saw your, I guess it's about a year ago or so, that you were quoted as saying it's an inevitability. And so even though it's kind of off the table for now, my sense is that you're saying it will happen sooner than later. How about that for a loaded question? And you can correct me for where I'm wrong, which is probably all of it.
No, you're on it for sure. I think this is one of those moments that if EPA had a do-over, the federal EPA, they may think about how this transpired. So I've been in contact, if not monthly, then a little bit more frequently, with the US EPA regional administrator in Dallas, who oversees both Texas and New Mexico and other states, as well as on a periodic basis talking to the Office of Air and Radiation, which is the DC based office that handles air quality issues. They are unequivocal that the air quality in the Permian Basin has degraded, and that they will be moving forward this year with a redesignation from attainment with the ambient air quality standard to non-attainment with the ambient air quality standard. That has certain regulatory requirements associated with it. So EPA is telling me that despite what was reported or people's inferences in seeing EPA put it in as a lower priority, it's not a question of if, it's just a matter of timing. So
and it sounds like pretty short timing if you're saying by the end of the year.
Yeah, I just spoke with EPA actually today on this exact topic, and they said they are still moving down that path. That road is still one traveled. So they're working their way down that. I'm saying it's inevitable because I look at our air quality monitoring data. Our rule that has kicked in last year will not have the substantive deadlines pass in order to reduce air quality emissions to avoid this redesignation. And on top of that, we work with EPA to do flyovers of both the Texas and New Mexico Permian. And quite frankly, if there's any judgment in my voice, it's right here, that the amount of leaks we see coming from operators I'll just speak on the New Mexico side, is still astonishing today, despite all the attention we've put on the Permian and EPA has. It's remarkable to see how many emissions are still occurring. So it's illogical to think that the air quality is going to get better when our rule is not in effect and the leaks are still occurring well above what we think they should be.
That's interesting you say that about the leaks, because if you read certain annual reports or whatever, it talks about how they've really improved and flare intensity is way down. And then you do hear other folks say, no, different environmental advocacy groups talk about how no, it isn't. So it's who's right. It's and maybe that one company has done a good job, but the industry as a whole hasn't, or maybe the flyovers aren't getting the detailed it just seems like there's data or really recognizable data missing on that, but it sounds like you're very convinced that you have the data.
Yeah, so I mean, I read as much as I can about whether people are saying the trends are going lower, the trends are going higher. This is not partisan to me whatsoever. This is fact. We fly over, we see it. We have the videos on our YouTube channel. We're about to upload a whole bunch more videos. It's absolutely happening. And I've heard a lot. I mean, again, I've already established PV equals nRT, Newtonian physics happens. But at the same time, anticipating those problems and then putting the resources in to correct them as quickly as possible is also important. I've had small oil and gas operators say we're hiring as many people as we can. We're running around in a truck. We're fixing these leaks. That's great. And I know they're doing it because we see it year to year. We see improvements in certain operators. On the flip side, I see some of these larger companies have said things to me like, we can't fix leaks that fast. All our folks are in Houston. Well, that's not my problem as to where the folks are. If the leak is here, you need to still fix it within a certain amount of, a very limited amount of time. Hire more New Mexicans. We have great people who could go out and fix those leaks as well. So it's a mixed bag, but the point is, since 2019, we've been doing flyovers. I haven't seen the leak rates improve. And therefore, I think the inevitability of redesignation, it's coming. I'm convinced it's going to happen.
And so walk it forward. We get designated as non-attainment. Then how's that play out?
Yeah, so it's a process. And what'll happen is it'll commence with both governors being notified that EPA intends to redesignate the area. So once that, I'll call it the governor letter, gets sent, then there's a clock that starts. And then we have to, I'll just speak for New Mexico, we have to come up with a strategy that is effectively going to curb those emissions and prove scientifically to EPA that within a requisite amount of time, we can improve the air quality back to attainment with the air quality standards. Typically, the course correction that EPA is looking for, or actually, it's not that they're looking for it. We will be required to do, both states will be required to do more monitoring and modeling, as well as the permitting process will change, meaning that if your potential to emit, which I've mentioned before, is sort of the gateway into our rule, that threshold goes way down, meaning more oil and gas operators will require more permits with more control devices. And those air pollution control devices are, cost doesn't weigh in as much any longer, meaning, and I'm trying to avoid the alphabet soup of acronyms here for you. And you're, yeah, I don't blame you. But there's certain terminology that kicks in, and basically the cost of emission controls is no longer a factor. And therefore you'll see more types of emission controls at smaller operations than you would have under today's current law. It's arduous. This is why I've requested $2 million from our legislature to prep my staff and to get our permitting process ready for what is going to come, so that we can meet the industry where they are and not have any glitches, if you will, where we're shutting in the industry.
Very good. Well, that seems like breaking news, because if I talked to various folks, I thought they would say that the non-attainment has kind of been put off, but it sounds like that's wishful thinking on their side. So this will be interesting how this plays out. Next category, sorry to jump here, but Part 50, the various rules. Would love to take this opportunity for you to kind of help us understand how that affects the operator, kind of maybe an overview, but kind of how that's going to affect and what we need to think about.
Yeah, Grant, great question. And maybe you can share with your viewers an infographic that we had put together to kind of help folks walk through how the rule affects them. But
Please.
yeah, so I'll make sure you have a copy of that. But effectively, what came into effect first was a couple things, which is making sure that you understand what your potential to emit is. So that's number one, and everybody has to go through that exercise. And then number two was getting a handle on your leaks through audible, visual, or olfactory leak detection. So we kicked off right there. And by the way, I should tell you and your viewers this, that as we worked on our ozone rule, which is what I'll call our oil and gas rule at the Environment Department, our sister agency, Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources. So think of maybe us as EPA and them as the Department of Interior. Maybe that's a helpful way to think of it. They focused on reducing methane emissions. And so you had these two rules coming out at this roughly the same time, targeting the same industry for reductions for kind of different purposes. What we did is we sat down the entire time, the 2 years it took us to develop both these rules. And I said, I can't tell the industry to do one thing and you tell them to do something differently. And suddenly we have two sets of requirements. I lived through that when I was at EPA with the Department of Interior.
Yep.
So that's not helpful to the industry. If there's one thing we can do is take this uncertain world and make it certain for them. So yeah, so we did that. And so their requirements is just as I described them, with quantifying your emissions and doing this AVO, audible, visual, and olfactory leak testing is the same. So you have that same requirement, but for both sets of rules, you do it once, you're in compliance with both. So that was what we had to do. And then we had things like engines, inventories coming into play at the beginning of this year. So all the components and whether you have a well with a separator, condenser, and a couple of tanks, or you're a bigger operation where you have engines and heater treaters and things like that. We wrote those requirements in a way that again, it's every step along the way. If you can't emit something, you have less or nothing to do. And those leak detection and repair requirements start kicking in as well. The other thing that I'll just highlight for you is for the very small operators, we gave them an opportunity to do even less, given how many employees and what their sales are, what their revenues are. And then we also gave every operator, as well as consulting firm, the opportunity to say, you guys got it wrong. And we want to propose something different to you that will be as effective, if not more effective. And we said, great, send us your options. So we have all alternatives to this technology agnostic rule that we put out to say, we have a different way of reducing emissions. Maybe that's, fence line monitors. Maybe that's, I probably shouldn't joke about balloons in the sky, but maybe they have, we're New Mexico, hot air balloons are very common here.
That's true,
But I know if I say a balloon in the sky, what people might think, but given recent news, but you know what I'm saying? We gave people options on how to do things better so that we don't write a rule that's stuck in 2022 technology. And we let people submit these alternatives to us that we would deem equivalent or better.
Let's focus on that point. And I know we're close to the end of our time, but there is a lot of talk of continuous monitoring and versus feet on the ground doing. How do you see that playing out? It's technology is getting better, but there is cost to it. It is continuous, but then you still have to go fix it. How do you see that OGI or kind of kind of trying to find those leaks, the various technology, and where you would like to see it go?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm super pragmatic about this. Industry and governments will never have enough people. I mean, I think and there's a return for both, whether you're for profit or nonprofit, on people power. I think there's really great technologies coming, and Grant, the fact that you and I are talking on Zoom, the fact that I can check on who's at my front door from my phone right now. My hot water heater starts leaking, it can shut itself off on its own. There's so many technologies where the price is coming down. And let's put it in oil and gas terminology. So is it possible to have an actuator shut off based on a SCADA system in Houston when you're monitoring emissions and work here in New Mexico? Absolutely. You don't always have to hop a plane and come to New Mexico to shut in a valve that's leaking. You can monitor your Braden head. There's so many things that can be strategically automated and strategically remote and real-time monitoring. That's only going to get better and cheaper. It's not for everybody. I get that. But those options are literally here at Home Depot today, let alone at the Grangers and everywhere else where you might be able to pick this up and start thinking about your operations a little bit differently. But again, I do think that $100,000+ OGI camera, like a FLIR camera, is an option for some, and people like it, especially if their systems have supported it, their people power, and it's worked for them. Others want to do real-time remote monitoring, fence line monitoring, and things like that. So, we can't be technology phobic, but I think there is a cost, and we're not immune here in understanding that. Let me just tell you another thing that I see as an opportunity on the horizon, and really for your listeners who are looking at this entrepreneurially, I think here's a really good option. Typically what I've seen is that oil and gas companies are focused on the cost of compliance because they're deploying their resources for their operations. And the world we live in is now putting value on data as opposed to process. So is it theoretical and probably going to happen that companies are going to fly the Delaware Basin, irrespective of state, create the commodity of data, and then sell it to these operators as well as governments? That's likely going to happen.
You're kind of seeing that happen now. You're seeing consortiums flying. So I think that's actually starting to happen.
Yeah, and so I think that changes the paradigm a little bit in terms of not only access to data, but then, are you effectively outsourcing your real-time and remote monitoring to a third party who does that for you, and you buy the commodity of data as opposed to the commodity of the service? And I think we're going to see that, and our rule supports that, because that is the direction that we heard from industry that they want to go. So we're in a really interesting time. I've been involved in oil and gas from EPA standpoint through my current position for about 13, 14 years now. And it's changed dramatically. I mean, forget boom and bust. It's changed dramatically in that time. So it's interesting to watch where it's going to go, and I'll certainly be watching your channel to keep in tune with what's happening.
Well, Secretary Kenney, I really appreciate not only that you were willing to be on here, but I think you answered forthrightly and directly, and sometimes with political figures, you don't always get that or believe you get it. So I appreciate the maybe it's that engineering background that you leaned on, but definitely appreciate your time and insight. And looks like you're going to be in the center of a lot of activity for a few years to come. Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome it, Grant. I'm the bad poker player, so you get what you get. So thank you, appreciate you and having me on. Thank you.
Very good.